Hey guys! So, tonight we're dimming the lights, fluffing the pillows and wandering through one of my favorite corners of history. Not the shiny kings, not the guys swinging swords around and carving their names into dusty chronicles, but the women. The queens who were technically in the background, but, let's be honest, were usually doing most of the actual scheming. Because here's the thing, for every king out there strutting around in his tights and trying to look majestic, there was often a queen in the background quietly pulling strings, writing letters, bribing people, or, sometimes, just rolling her eyes while watching her husband ruin everything. And weirdly, these women don't get much spotlight. History. Textbooks usually give them one line like, "She was his wife, she had children." Cool, thanks. That really tells us so much. So tonight we're going to float through their stories. The queens who mattered but weren't supposed to. The ones with brains sharper than the royal cutlery, but who had to hide it behind embroidery, hoops and polite smiles. And as always, we're keeping this slow, calm, and just a little bit sarcastic, because if there's one thing royals were consistently good at, it was being ridiculous. So, dim your lights, grab your tea, and let's start drifting. Our first stop, medieval France. Always messy, always dramatic, always full of bad haircuts and even worse, politics. Let's talk about Eleanor of Aquitaine. She's technically not forgotten in the sense that historians do know her name. But the way she gets described is usually something like Queen, consort of France and then of England, mother of Richard the Lionheart, which is kind of like introducing Beyoncé as Jay-Z's wife, who also had some kids. Yeah, not the full story. Eleanor was born in 1122 in what is now southwestern France. And here's the thing, she wasn't just some minor duchess. She inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine, one of the largest, richest pieces of land in France, when she was 15. 15. At that age, most medieval girls were being told to focus on needlework and piety. Eleanor was busy becoming one of the most powerful landholders in Europe, and immediately everyone wanted a piece of her. Kings, dukes, knights, basically every ambitious guy with a crown collection looked at her and thought, yes please. So naturally, the King of France swooped in and married her to his heir, Louis VII. And thus teenage Eleanor became Queen of France. Now, Louis VII was, how do I put this nicely? He was a bit of a wet blanket, the kind of man who, according to chroniclers, was deeply pious, deeply serious, and deeply boring. Eleanor, by contrast, was vibrant, witty, ambitious. She liked music, poetry, fashion, and power games. Their personalities fit together about as well as a wine goblet and holy water. Still, they managed to play royal couple for a while, but then came the Crusades, because, of course, Eleanor went with Louis on the Second Crusade in the 1140s, and this is where things went sideways. Imagine it, the King of France, trying to be very holy, chrétien, marching through the Middle East while his wife Eleanor, dressed in armor, allegedly, was mingling with knights, chatting with leaders, and making actual military suggestions. People whispered, scandals brewed. At one point, rumors spread that she had an inappropriate closeness with her uncle, Raymond of Antioch, which, to be clear, was not great PR for a queen. Louis was not amused. The marriage soured. By 1152, they had the medieval equivalent of a messy divorce. Officially, it was annulled because they were too closely related, which is hilarious considering that literally every royal marriage at the time was between cousins, but sure, that was the reason. Eleanor didn't sit around crying into her embroidery hoop. Nope. Within weeks, literally weeks, she remarried. And not just anyone. She snagged Henry Plantagenet, the future King Henry II of England. Power move, absolute queen behavior. And just like that, Eleanor upgraded from Queen of France to Queen of England. She also brought Aquitaine with her, which meant Henry suddenly controlled half of France in addition to England. Basically, thanks to Eleanor, he was now one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. Of course, Henry wasn't exactly a walk in the garden either. He was fiery, hot-tempered, and thought he was the smartest man alive. Eleanor tolerated him for a while, long enough to produce 8 children. Yes, 8, including 2 kings, Richard the Lionheart and John. Yes, that King John of Robin Hood fame, the whiny one. But Eleanor wasn't just a baby machine. She was running her lands, sponsoring troubadours, and building a cultural court that became the envy of Europe. She essentially invented the idea of courtly love, all those knights writing flowery poetry about unattainable ladies. That's Eleanor's brand. Then came the inevitable family drama. Henry cheated. Shocker. Eleanor got fed up. And eventually, she backed her sons in rebellion against their father. Imagine it, the Queen of England, mother of princes, openly supporting her kids in trying to overthrow her husband. Bold move. Predictably, it backfired. Henry crushed the rebellion and locked Eleanor up for years. But karma, as always, had a sense of humour. When Henry died, her favourite son Richard became king, and Eleanor was released, stepping right back into politics like nothing happened. She ruled as regent while Richard was off on crusade, basically running England herself. When Richard died, she supported her other son John, though, honestly, maybe that was a mistake. Eleanor lived into her 80s. In the 12th century, outliving her husbands, outliving many of her children, outliving nearly everyone who ever underestimated her. She died in 1204, quietly in a convent, having collected more crowns and drama than most medieval men could dream of. So yes, she wasn't just Richard's mom. She was the Duchess who became queen twice, rebelled against her husband, invented a whole cultural movement, and outlasted them all. Forgotten queen? Maybe. But definitely unforgettable once you actually tell her story. Let's float away from Eleanor now, across the channel, across the centuries, to another queen whose life looked glittering on the outside, but who ended up being one of the loneliest women in history. Up next, Spain, gold palaces, and, oh yes, madness. So, let's head south. France was messy, sure. England was chaotic, but Spain, late medieval, early Renaissance Spain, was on a whole different level of royal drama. Palaces dripping with gold, court politics as sharp as a Toledo blade, and a family tree that looked less like a tree and more like, well, a tangled shrub that kept folding back on itself. But before we get into the full nightmare, we have to talk about Isabella of Castile. Because yes, she's technically remembered. She's in every school textbook, usually described as the queen who funded Columbus, which is true. But it's also kind of like saying, yeah, she changed the entire trajectory of the world, but also She was just the lady who signed a check. Not exactly fair. Isabella of Castile, the Queen, who played the long game. Isabella was born in 1451. She wasn't supposed to matter all that much at first. She was a younger sibling, not the heir, and medieval Spain was fractured, to put it gently. Multiple kingdoms, endless rivalries, nobles constantly scheming. Basically, everyone was stabbing everyone else in the back, sometimes literally. But Isabella had this thing: patience and a spine of steel. She quietly observed, waited, and when the chance came, she made her move. At 18, she married Ferdinand of Aragon. Yes, that Ferdinand. Their marriage in 1469 basically united Castile and Aragon, which meant two of the biggest Spanish kingdoms were suddenly one power couple. Now let's be clear. Ferdinand was ambitious, but Isabella wasn't the type to sit in the background sewing cushions. She insisted on ruling jointly, not as the wife of the king. Nope. Her name was on the royal decrees. Her signature mattered. Their crowns were equal. And honestly, she was the more capable of the two. Together they pulled off some pretty dramatic projects. The Reconquista, expelling the last Muslim kingdom of Granada, happened on their watch. They reformed the chaotic Spanish. Government curbed the nobles and centralized power. Basically, Isabella was one of those rare monarchs who could actually manage paperwork and wars. Of course, then there's the darker side. She and Ferdinand also launched the Spanish Inquisition. Yes, the thing Monty Python made fun of centuries later. It wasn't funny at the time. Forced conversions, brutal interrogations, expulsions. Not exactly bedtime cozy, but it was Isabella's idea of unity. Everyone in her kingdom needed to be the same religion, or else. And she enforced it. And then, yes, she funded Christopher Columbus. Not because she thought he'd find America. No one had New World on their bingo card. She thought he'd find a quick trade route to Asia. Instead, he stumbled into the Caribbean, claimed it for Spain, and the rest is, well, the mess we all know. Isabella died in 1504, but by then she had transformed Spain from a fractured collection of squabbling kingdoms into the rising superpower of Europe. Ferdinand got the credit sometimes, but let's be honest, Isabella was the backbone. Without her, he'd probably still be arguing with some duke about taxes, but the story doesn't. Stop with her! Because Isabella had children, and while she was a powerhouse, her kids inherited more problems than stability. And that brings us to one of the saddest, strangest queens in European history, Juana of Castile, better known by her unfortunate nickname Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, which, wow, that's a branding problem if I've ever heard one. Imagine being remembered for 500 years, not for your policies or your power, but for allegedly being the crazy one. Thanks, history. Juana was Isabella's daughter, born in 1473, and like most royal kids, she wasn't supposed to inherit anything. She was the middle child, tucked behind older siblings who were meant to marry well and rule, but then fate started, playing dominoes. One sibling died, then another, then another. And suddenly Juana was the heir to Castile. Here's the problem. Juana was sensitive. Not weak, necessarily, but definitely not built for the cold brutality of royal politics. And the people around her knew it, which meant she was ripe for exploitation. Her parents married her off to Philip of Burgundy, better known as Philip the Handsome, which, yes, was his actual nickname. Spoiler, he was not that handsome, more like the medieval equivalent of a smug Instagram model with an overdeveloped jawline. But sure, let's go with the handsome. Juana fell for him hard, too hard. She was passionately, obsessively in love with him. And unfortunately, Philip was a player. He loved her in his own way, but he also cheated, constantly. Juana, in turn, became consumed with jealousy. Chroniclers describe her flying into fits of rage, confronting him in public, breaking down in tears, then clinging to him again. Basically, she was spiraling. And Philip? He didn't handle it well. He mocked her, dismissed her, and used her reputation against her. Any time she protested his affairs, he'd spread the idea that she was unstable, and surprise, people believed him. Because when you're a queen and a woman, it's very easy for the narrative to become, oh, she's just hysterical. When Isabella died in 1504, Juana became Queen of Castile. On paper, at least. In reality, she had no chance. Her husband Philip, her father Ferdinand, and later her son Charles, all maneuvered to keep her out of actual power. They declared her mad, locked her away, and used her title while they ruled in her name. There's a particularly sad story. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, Juana refused to let his body be buried. She reportedly travelled with his coffin for months, opening it to look at him, insisting he wasn't gone. Was it grief, madness, or just desperation, clinging to the only love she thought she had? Historians still debate. What's certain is this. For the next 46 years, yes, 46, Juana was imprisoned. First by her father, then by her son Charles the Active, locked away in convents, palaces, guarded rooms. Technically, she remained Queen of Castile until her death in 1555, but she never actually ruled. She was queen in name, ghost in life. Her story is one of the starkest contrasts in history. Her mother, Isabella, was one of the most powerful women of the late Middle Ages. Juana, her daughter, inherited the crown but none of the freedom. She was stripped of agency, branded insane, and remembered as La Loca, a queen, but forgotten in every way that mattered. So there you have it. From Isabella, the iron-willed architect of Spain, to Juana, the tragic pawn who never got to rule. Two women tied together by blood, but separated by fate, and by how kindly or unkindly history chose to remember them. Let's float onward now, across the Mediterranean, past palaces and courts toward another queen, one who ruled Egypt when she wasn't technically supposed to, and whose face, whether on coins or on busts, became one of the most famous in the ancient world. Yes, you guessed it, Cleopatra.
All right, so let's just float down the Nile for a minute. The water's calm, the temples are gleaming, and somewhere in a palace there's a woman who somehow managed to become one of the most famous figures in history despite every effort
of later Roman writers to smear her name into the mud. Yes, Cleopatra VII. Because, fun fact, there were 6 Cleopatras before her.
But nobody remembers those. She's the brand name, the one who stuck. And before we get into the drama, because oh, there is drama, let's talk about her background. Cleopatra wasn't even fully Egyptian technically. She was Macedonian Greek.
descended from Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals. The Ptolemaic dynasty had been ruling Egypt for centuries by the time she came along, and they had developed a few, let's say, quirky habits. For one, they loved keeping it in the family, literally, brother-sister marriages all around, because nothing says dynastic stability like refusing to let any outsiders marry in. Sure, it worked for a while. And then, well, let's just say the gene pool started looking more like a gene puddle, Cleopatra herself. She broke the mold a little. She was one of the few Ptolemies who actually learned to speak Egyptian. Most of her predecessors couldn't be bothered. They ruled Egypt but only spoke Greek. Cleopatra, though, spoke multiple languages. Ancient sources say as many as 9, which, considering most kings could barely get through one, was impressive. So, when she came to power around 51 BCE, she wasn't just another royal figurehead. She was smart, calculating, and not afraid to do what was necessary to stay on the throne, which for her usually meant partnering up with very powerful Roman men. Enter Julius Caesar. At the time, Rome was basically holding Egypt's leash. Cleopatra's throne was shaky. Her brother, Ptolemy III, was trying to edge her out. Civil war was brewing. And then Caesar showed up in Alexandria in 48 BCE. Now, the famous story is that Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters.
Rolled up in a rug. Was that literally true? Who knows? Ancient writers loved a good dramatic flourish.
But it's certain that she found a way to charm him, gain his protection, and tilt the balance of power back in her favor. With Caesar on her side, she reclaimed her throne, officially ruling as pharaoh. But she wasn't just clinging to him. She was making a calculated alliance. She knew Rome was the superpower. She knew survival meant playing that game. She also had his child, little Caesarion. And yes, the name is exactly what it sounds like. Subtlety was not their strong suit. Fast forward a few years, Caesar is assassinated, Rome plunges into chaos, and Cleopatra, ever pragmatic, shifts gears. She aligns with Mark Antony, Caesar's ally general, and one of the contenders for Roman power. Their partnership was legendary, part political, part romantic, and definitely part theatrical. Cleopatra knew how to make an entrance. There's a story about her meeting Antony by sailing up the river on a golden barge, dressed as the goddess Isis, surrounded by musicians, perfumes wafting through the air. Because why just walk into a meeting when you can arrive like a literal deity? Together they built a power base. They had 3 children. They ruled Egypt jointly, in style, trying to carve out a corner of independence even as Rome loomed over everything. But of course this made enemies. Octavian, later Augustus, saw them as a threat. He was Rome's future, and Antony, with Cleopatra, was a rival he couldn't tolerate. Cue propaganda. Cue endless speeches about that foreign seductress corrupting our noble Roman general. Cleopatra became Rome's favorite villainess, the femme fatale dragging Antony down. We all know how it ended. Antony and Cleopatra lost at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Their forces scattered. Antony, in despair, fell on his sword. Cleopatra, cornered, famously committed suicide, allegedly by letting a snake bite her. Though let's be honest, historians still debate if it was poison, dagger, or snake. What matters is the image. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, choosing death over humiliation. Octavian marched into Alexandria, took her children, erased her legacy where he could, and Rome made sure the story stuck. Cleopatra was the manipulative temptress, the foreign queen who tried to bring down their empire. But if you strip away the Roman spin, what you see is something different. A woman who ruled for 20 years, who spoke to her people in their own language, who maneuvered her rivals again and again, and who dared to stand toe-to-toe with Rome itself. Forgotten queen? Not really. She's remembered, but often in the wrong way. Not as a ruler, but as a lover. Not as a strategist, but as a seductress. The irony is that Cleopatra's greatest skill wasn't her beauty, it was her brain. And in the end, even Rome couldn't erase that completely. Let's drift onward again. Leave the sands of Egypt behind, slip back into the mists of Europe, and find ourselves in yet another royal court. This time, not ancient, not medieval, but early modern. A place of velvet gowns, powdered wigs, and the occasional royal meltdown. Uppy. Next, Anne of Austria, Queen of France, mother of Louis XIV, and one of the most underestimated power players of the 17th century. All right, so let's gently float into 17th century France, the land of velvet drapes, endless etiquette rules, and more powdered faces than a modern beauty aisle. And in the middle of all that, there's Anne of Austria. Quick clarification. Despite the Austria in her name, she was Spanish, because of course she was. Royals back then seemed to trade daughters like playing cards. Spain and Austria were ruled by the Habsburgs, Europe's most inbred dynasty, and Anne was a Habsburg princess, shipped off to France at age 14 to marry the young King Louis XIII. So picture it. A teenage girl, fluent in Spanish, raised in the stiff etiquette of Madrid, suddenly plopped into the French court, a place already buzzing with rival factions, side-eyeing nobles and courtiers, who basically lived to gossip. She wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms. Her marriage to Louis XIII, let's just say it wasn't the romance of the century. He was quiet, awkward, and reportedly more comfortable with his hunting dogs than with his wife. They barely spoke the same language, literally and figuratively. For years their marriage was rocky, and the court whispered constantly about Anne's supposed affairs. Because if you were a queen and your husband ignored you, everyone just assumed you were sneaking around. Spoiler. There's no real evidence she cheated, but Theramores stuck anyway. Here's where Anne's story turns into one long, slow burn of royal anxiety. She and Louis XIII were married for over 20 years, with no children, which in royal terms was basically a national crisis. Every year without an heir was another round of gossip about infertility, divine punishment, or, again, Anne's alleged affairs. Finally, after 2 decades of waiting, she had a son, the future Louis XIV, the Sun King. And then, because once the pressure was off, the floodgates opened, she had another son, Philippe, a couple of years later. Just like that, France went from worrying about a dying dynasty to having 2 healthy heirs. And Anne, once dismissed as the foreign queen who couldn't produce, suddenly mattered again. Louis XIII died in 1643, leaving little Louis XIV as a 4-year-old king, which meant Anne, at age 41, became regent. And this is where she really shines. Everyone expected her to be a passive placeholder, easily manipulated. Instead, she teamed up with Cardinal Mazarin, a sharp Italian minister, and held France together during one of its messiest chapters. Nobles rose in rebellion, cities rioted, wars dragged on. The whole thing is remembered as the Fronde, which sounds cute, but was basically France's version of let's all throw a tantrum against the crown. Anne held firm, calm, steady, and stubborn. She outmaneuvered rebellious princes, soothed public anger, and made sure her son stayed on the throne. And when the Fronde finally fizzled out, the monarchy came out stronger. Anne's regency ended when Louis XIV came of age. And if you know anything about him, you know he wasn't exactly shy. The guy literally called himself the Sun King. Subtlety was not his brand, but he owed a lot to his mother. She had protected his throne, raised him in an atmosphere of strict Catholic piety, and drilled into him the idea of absolute monarchy. When he strutted around Versailles later in life declaring, "I am the state," well, you can thank Anne for planting the seed. She lived long enough to see her son rise in power, to watch him become the most dazzling monarch in Europe. And then quietly, she faded into the background, retiring to a convent. She died in 1666, remembered, by some as cold, by others as fiercely protective, but always underestimated. Anne of Austria didn't conquer new lands. She didn't build palaces. She didn't even leave behind any juicy scandals that we can confirm. What she did was survive, outlast the whispers, outlast the rebellions, and make sure her son inherited a crown that hadn't crumbled. And sometimes survival was the greatest power move of all. Let's leave France now, slip across the sea, eastward, into another empire. One that was larger, wealthier, and far more diverse than anything Europe could dream up. The Mughal Empire. And waiting for us there, Nur Jahan, a queen consort who technically wasn't supposed to matter, and yet ended up running one of the richest courts in the world. So, picture this. It's the early 1600s. The Mughal Empire is at its height. Palaces, gardens, jeweled thrones. The whole thing looks like something out of a dream. And in the middle of it all is a woman who technically wasn't born royal, but somehow ended up being one of the most powerful figures in India, Nur Jahan. Her name literally means light of the world.
Modest, right? But honestly, it kind of fit. She was born Mir-un-Nissa in 1577, the daughter of Persian nobles who fled to India when things got messy back home. So, from the beginning, she wasn't exactly destined to be an empress. She grew up in Agra, married young, and lived a pretty standard aristocratic life until her first husband died in battle. That could have been the end of her story, a widow fading quietly into the background. But fate had other plans, because around 1611 she caught the attention of Emperor Jahangir, and not just in a passing way. He fell completely, hopelessly in love. Now Jahangir was complicated, brilliant in some ways, but also famously indulgent. He loved art, poetry, gardens, and wine, lots of wine. He wasn't exactly the most reliable ruler on the block, which is probably why Nur Jahan stepped in.
Once she married Jahangir, she didn't just sit around in silks looking pretty. She got involved deeply. She advised him on state matters, influenced court appointments, and even issued imperial orders. And here's the kicker. Coins were minted in her name. Actual Mughal currency bearing the words "struck in the name of Queen Nur Jahan." That's not consort-level power, that's co-ruler-level power. She also developed her own network. She placed her family members in key posts, arranged strategic marriages, and essentially built a faction within the court that revolved around her. This was the Mughal version of leaning in, except instead of boardrooms and coffee orders, it was elephant hunts and fortresses, and yet she balanced it all with image-making. She cultivated this persona of elegance, refinement, and cultural sophistication. The gardens she sponsored, the textiles she made fashionable, the poetry she endorsed, her influence seeped into every corner of Mughal culture. Even her fashion sense stuck. The flowing style of women's clothing she popularized eventually evolved into what we know today as the salwar kameez. Not bad for a side project, but of course, no queen who rises this high gets away without pushback. The nobles who resented her influence whispered constantly, "She's controlling the emperor, she's too ambitious, she's disrupting the natural order." Same old complaints you see across history. Whenever a woman in power dares to, actually wield power, and as Jahangir's health declined, things got harder. Factions at court fought over succession. Nur Jahan backed her son-in-law Shahryar, but ultimately the throne went to Shah Jahan, the future builder of the Taj Mahal. And let's just say, Shah Jahan wasn't in the mood to let his stepmother hang around pulling strings. So Nur Jahan was sidelined. Politely, of course. She was given a pension, retired to live quietly in Lahore, and spent her later years focusing on gardens, poetry, and religion. No more coins in her name, no more state orders signed by her hand. She died in 1645, buried in a tomb she designed herself, and if you visit it today, it's simple, elegant, almost understated, which is kind of ironic, considering the empire she once ruled from behind the veil. Nur Jahan's story is one of those rare ones where you can see a consort stepping directly into the role of ruler. No fiction, no flowery exaggeration. Her power was real. She signed decrees, issued currency, directed policy, and yet history still tends to tuck her into the category of influential wife, which is like calling Steve Jobs a guy who liked computers. Forgotten queen? Absolutely, but also unforgettable once you look closely. Let's drift onward again, past Mughal domes, past the scent of rose gardens, back into Europe. Because waiting in the wings is another queen who wasn't supposed to be in charge, but ended up ruling Britain through one of its stormiest political eras. Yes, Queen Anne, the last Stuart. The one history mostly remembers for being sickly, tragic, and surrounded by squabbling politicians. But who, quietly, left behind one of the biggest
legacies of all, the Kingdom of Great Britain itself.
So let's head to Britain at the turn of the 18th century. The Whigs are enormous, the politics are petty, and the royal family is, barely hanging on by a thread. And right in the middle of all this is Queen Anne. Now, if you've heard of Anne at all, it's probably because of the movie The Favourite, with Olivia Colman eating cake, shouting at courtiers, and looking perpetually exhausted, which honestly is not a bad summary of Anne's vibe, but the real story, it's even sadder and sleepier. Anne was born in 1665, the daughter of James, Duke of York, who later became James II. From the start, she wasn't exactly thriving. She suffered from poor eyesight, gout, obesity, and chronic illnesses her whole life. Basically, if there was a royal child least likely to end up ruling, it was Anne. She grew up with her sister Mary. The two of them shuffled between households, educated in the strict Protestant tradition that England was so obsessed with at the time. You'd think she would have faded into obscurity. Except, of course, England was never subtle when it came to dynastic drama. Anne married Prince George of Denmark in 1683, and how do I put this? He was nice. That's pretty much all anyone ever says about him. He wasn't glamorous, wasn't brilliant, but he was loyal, and that alone made him better than half the royal husbands we've talked about so far. Anne actually loved him, which was rare in arranged marriages. They were close companions. But here's where her life turned into one long tragedy. She was
pregnant at least 17 times. 17! Out of those, most ended in miscarriages or stillbirths. Only one child, William, Duke of Gloucester, survived infancy, and he died at age 11. Imagine it. 17 pregnancies, no surviving children, and you're the heir to the throne. That level of loss is almost unfathomable, and it weighed on her constantly. When her sister Mary II died in 1694 and her brother-in-law William III followed in 1702, Anne, sickly, grieving, limping, suddenly became queen.
Not because anyone thought she was ideal, but because, frankly, she was the only one left. Her reign was dominated by politics she barely controlled. The two major parties, the Whigs and the Tories, were fighting constantly. War with France dragged on endlessly. Parliament pushed, pulled, and nagged her into decisions. And Anne, never the healthiest or strongest-willed, struggled to keep control. But here's the twist. Despite all her personal tragedy and political weakness, Anne presided over one of the most important changes in British history. In 1707, under her reign, England and Scotland formally united. The Kingdom of Great Britain was born. That's right, the flag, the identity, the whole concept of Great Britain comes from Queen Anne's signature. By her last years, Anne was almost entirely bedridden. She could barely walk, barely see, and was racked with constant pain. Her beloved husband George died in 1708, leaving her lonelier than ever. She sank deeper into depression, surrounded by squabbling ministers and the occasional dramatic falling out with her closest female confidants. She died in 1714 at just 49. And with her, the Stuart dynasty died too. No heirs, no children, just endless tragedy and the legacy of a union. She probably didn't even realize would matter so much centuries later. Anne is one of those queens history tends to brush over. Oh yes, the sickly one, the one with all the dead babies. But if you peel back the layers, she's also the queen who saw Britain take its first steps into being the empire it would later become. Not by dazzling speeches or conquests, but simply by being the last thread holding things together. Forgotten, definitely, but essential all the same. So let's drift onward again. Away from the damp chill of England across the sea into a very different empire, an empire of sultans, domes, and harems, because waiting for us there is one of the most legendary power players of the Ottoman world, Kusum Sultan. She wasn't even officially a queen. She was a consort, a mother, and later
a grandmother. But make no mistake, she ruled an empire from behind the screens.
So here she comes, Kusum Sultan, born around 1589 on a Greek island originally named Anastasia. She was just some provincial girl until she got swept up into the Ottoman slave system and sent to the imperial harem, which, by the way, was less like the scandalous fantasies Westerners imagined and more like a political finishing school crossed with a reality show. She converted to Islam, was renamed Marpaika, meaning moon-faced, which was either a compliment or a polite stretch, and then called Kosum, which means leader of the herd. Subtle, but very on-brand for what she would become. Kosum caught the eye of Sultan Ahmed I. He wasn't the most terrifying of sultans, but he had taste and, apparently, a soft spot for clever women. She quickly rose to become his chief consort. Now, here's the twist. Ahmed died young, really young, and Ottoman succession wasn't exactly stable. Every time a sultan died, it could turn into a survival game for the women of the harem. But Kusum? She didn't just survive, she thrived. When Ahmed's weak younger brother Mustafa briefly became sultan, she stepped back, waited. When Ahmed's son Murad IV took the throne, he was just 11. So who ran the empire? Kusum. She was officially named Valide Sultan, mother of the Sultan, and became regent. And when I say regent, I don't mean ceremonial. She literally held council meetings, signed decrees, and told viziers what to do for decades. Now her sons were, well, let's call them complicated. Murad IV turned into one of the most brutal rulers the empire ever had. He banned coffee, alcohol and tobacco, then prowled the streets at night in disguise, personally executing anyone who broke the rules. Yes, imagine the Sultan hiding behind a corner with a sword, waiting to catch someone smoking. That was Murad. And then came Ibrahim I, also known as Ibrahim the Mad, which is never a great nickname for a monarch. He was unstable, unpredictable, and allegedly obsessed with plus-sized women to a level that became court gossip. Imagine running an empire when your sultan is fixated on body types more than politics. Not ideal. So naturally it was Kosum who had to keep things from completely
collapsing.
She balanced viziers, negotiated with factions, and quietly managed the empire from her palace apartments. You'd think, after all this, she'd retire. But no, when her grandson Mehmed IV came to the throne as a child, Kosum was back in power, as regent again. By this point, she had been ruling from behind the curtain for over 40 years. That's longer than most actual sultans lasted. But here's the thing, longevity breeds enemies. Her daughter-in-law, Turhan Sultan, also wanted influence over young Mehmed. Cue a classic palace power struggle. Kosum, in her 60s, still sharp, tried to outmaneuver Turhan. It didn't end well. In 1651, Turhan supporters strangled Kosum with a curtain cord inside the palace, which is about as harem drama as it gets. Kösem Sultan is remembered as one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. She wasn't a queen, she wasn't even free in the Western sense, but she steered an empire through 3 sultans, countless crises, and decades of dysfunction. Her reign marks what historians call the Sultanate of Women, a century where consorts and mothers of sultans basically ruled while their male relatives floundered. And Kösem was the absolute centerpiece of it. Forgotten queen? Maybe not forgotten in Turkey, but in the wider world she's barely a footnote. Yet she shaped the fate of millions, all while living behind latticed windows
and palace walls. Right, let's glide on, still in the Ottoman world, but to her successor in the harem power game.
Another woman who came from nowhere and bent an empire around her will. Hürrem Sultan, better known in the West as Roxolana. She went from a captured slave girl to the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. Yes, the Magnificent One. And she made sure no one ever forgot her influence. Picture this. It's the early 1500s. The Ottoman Empire is massive, stretching across 3 continents, richer than most of Europe combined. And at the very center of it all sits Suleiman the Magnificent. He's handsome, brilliant, cultured,
a military genius, basically the total package, and then into his life walks a teenager, a slave girl.
From somewhere in modern-day Ukraine or Poland, depending on which source you trust. She was captured in a raid, dragged to Istanbul, and deposited in the imperial harem. Her original name is lost to history, but the Ottomans renamed her Hürrem, the cheerful one. In Europe, she'd be called Roxolana, and against all odds, she went from powerless captive to the most powerful woman in the empire. Now, normally, the Sultan's harem worked like a conveyor belt. Concubines came and went. A sultan never married, officially, because that would tie him too closely to one family. Keep things fluid, keep things safe. That was the idea, but Suleiman broke all the rules for Hürrem. He didn't just keep her around, he fell in love deeply. He wrote poetry for her. He promoted her above every other woman. And then he did the unthinkable. He married her, legally, publicly. This was basically a scandal. It hadn't happened in centuries. Imagine the gossip. The great Suleiman
married a slave girl. Court officials were horrified. Nobles panicked. But Suleiman didn't care. He adored her, and that was that, of course. Hürrem wasn't just sitting around embroidering pillows. She was sharp, ambitious, and knew how
to play palace politics better than anyone. She had several sons with Suleiman, and her main goal was simple: make sure one of them inherited the throne. Because in the Ottoman system, when a sultan died, all his sons basically fought it out, and usually they killed each other. Charming system, really. The biggest obstacle, Suleiman's eldest son Mustafa, born to another concubine. Mustafa was popular, competent, and very much in the way of Hürrem's children. What followed was one of the darkest power plays in Ottoman history. Through a mix of palace intrigue, whispers, and manipulations, Hürrem and her allies convinced Suleiman that Mustafa was plotting against him. The end result? Mustafa was strangled in his tent by the Sultan's order, a tragic, brutal act, but one that cleared the path for Hürrem's sons. Hurrem didn't stop at family politics. She stepped into the public sphere in ways no imperial woman had before. She wrote letters to foreign rulers. She advised Suleiman directly on matters of state. Ambassadors complained, sometimes in awe, sometimes in horror, that she had the Sultan's ear on everything, and she spent lavishly on charity projects, mosques, schools, soup kitchens, hospitals. Her name spread across the empire, engraved in stone. She wasn't content to be hidden. She wanted her influence written into the city itself. Hurrem died in 1558 before Suleiman himself. But by then she had completely reshaped the Ottoman system. The idea that a concubine could rise to official wife, that the Sultan's partner could openly wield political influence, that all began with her. She wasn't universally loved, far from it. Many saw her as manipulative, ruthless, even destructive. But there's no denying her impact. Without Hurrem, there would have been no Kusum, no sultanate of women. She set the precedent. And as for Suleiman, he never remarried. He lived another 8 years, and when he died, he was buried beside her in Istanbul. For all his conquests, all his campaigns, all his magnificence, his heart stayed with the woman history once dismissed as a mere slave. So, from Roxolana's glittering Istanbul, let's drift eastward, beyond the desert palaces, past the Persian courts, over the Silk Road, into China. Because waiting for us there is another woman who broke every rule, outmaneuvered every rival, and crowned herself in a way that no one thought possible. Empress Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to officially rule as emperor in her own name, not just as a wife, not as regent, but as the ruler of China. Let's set the scene. It's the 7th century Tang dynasty. China is wealthy, cosmopolitan, full of poetry, art, and silk. The emperors of Tang were supposed to be untouchable, semi-divine figures, and into this world stepped Wu Zetian. She was born in 624, the daughter of a relatively comfortable family.
Not royal, not particularly destined for greatness. At 14, she was sent to the palace as a low-ranking concubine of Emperor Taizong. Yes, 14, because medieval palace politics were, well, horrifying. Now, most girls sent in at this level were basically background decoration, but Wu, she had ambition and patience, which are dangerous in combination. Wu started off as just another concubine, one of dozens. Taizong, the emperor, wasn't that into her, but she observed, learned, studied court life like a chessboard. When Taizong died, most of his concubines were sent off to Buddhist convents to live out their days in obscurity. Wu was supposed to vanish quietly into a nunnery, but she didn't. She had already caught the eye of Taizong's son and successor, Emperor Gaozong. And when he took the throne, he brought her back to court, which was, by the way, scandalous. Imagine your dad dies, and you bring one of his concubines into your bed. People whispered. Wu ignored them. Once back in the palace, Wu Zetian's rise was unstoppable. She started as a concubine, then worked her way up to Empress Consort, replacing Gaozong's first wife. The story goes that Wu accused the Empress of killing her infant daughter, a charge that led to the Empress being deposed. Historians argue about whether Wu actually orchestrated the child's death herself, but let's be honest, subtlety wasn't her style.
With rivals removed, Wu became the official empress, and from then on, she didn't just share power with Gaozong, she dominated it. Gaozong was weak, often ill, and frankly not very assertive. Courtiers even referred to him behind his back as the two sages, meaning Wu was effectively co-ruler, which is a polite way of saying she ran the show. When Gaozong died in 683, Wu should have retired. That's what widowed empresses did, step aside, let the next generation of men take over. But Wu wasn't playing that game. She declared herself Empress Dowager, placed her young sons on the throne one after another, and ruled as regent. When those sons proved inconvenient, one too independent, another too pliant, she sidelined them. And then, in 690, she did something no woman had ever done in China. She declared herself emperor. Not empress in the wife sense, but emperor. She even founded her own dynasty, the Zhou, interrupting the Tang line. Imagine the shock. For centuries, Chinese ideology was rooted in Confucianism, which said women should obey their fathers, husbands, and sons in sequence. Wu basically walked in and said, "Cute theory, anyway, I'm emperor now." Wu Zetian wasn't just sitting on a stolen throne. She actually ruled effectively. She promoted talented officials regardless of background, expanded the exam system for civil service, and kept the empire stable. She was ruthless with rivals. Yes, there were purges, executions, plenty of enemies crushed, but she also rewarded loyalty and competence. She sponsored Buddhism, building massive temples and promoting herself as a semi-divine figure. At one point, she even had a huge bronze Buddha cast with her own features. Subtle, right? And she kept her image carefully managed. She ordered historians to rewrite records, portraying herself as destined by prophecy. She wasn't just a ruler. She wanted to be remembered as the ruler. By her later years, though, age caught up. She was in her 80s, unheard of at the time, and increasingly isolated. Her favourites at court, including much younger lovers, caused scandal. Ministers plotted behind her back. In 705, she was finally forced to abdicate in favour of restoring the Tang dynasty. She died shortly after. And here's the kicker, her tomb is unique. Her stele, the big inscribed stone slab that normally boasts about the emperor's greatness, was left blank, completely empty. No words, no titles, nothing. Historians debate why. Some think it was meant as an insult by her enemies, erasing her legacy. Others think Wu herself ordered it as a kind of defiant mic drop. My deeds speak for themselves. Either way, it's eerie. The only woman emperor of China buried with silence. Wu Zetian remains one of history's most controversial figures. In China, she was long painted as a manipulative usurper. Later generations softened the view, seeing her as effective, even visionary. But even today, she's a paradox, remembered and erased at the same time. She ruled an empire that thought women should be invisible. And she carved her name into history anyway. From Wu's iron grip on Tang China, let's float to another empire in the east. A dynasty where concubines and mothers also held sway behind the curtain. The Ming and Qing courts had their own hidden queens, including the formidable Empress Dowager Cixi. But before we jump to her, let's pass briefly through a few lesser-known Chinese empresses who shaped the dynasties quietly in the shadows. Because Not every queen needed to grab the throne to pull the strings. It's the mid-19th century. The Qing dynasty is still technically in charge, but let's be honest, things aren't going well. Foreign powers are nibbling at China's coasts, rebellions are tearing up the countryside, and the imperial court is basically drowning in silk robes and outdated etiquette. And into this mess walks Cixi. She wasn't born noble, just a minor Manchu family, nothing particularly flashy, but she entered the Forbidden City as a concubine of Emperor Xianfeng, which sounds glamorous, but in practice meant being one of dozens of women competing for a bored emperor's attention. Except Cixi got it. She gave birth to his only surviving son, the future Tongji emperor. And that was her golden ticket. When Emperor Xianfeng died in 1861, his heir was only 5 years old. Cue the regency crisis. Several high-ranking ministers thought they could rule as guardians. But Cixi, now Empress Dowager, teamed up with another widow, Empress Dowager Xian, and staged what historians politely call the Xinyu coup. Translation. She outmaneuvered the men, seized the imperial seals, and suddenly little 5-year-old Tongji had 2 mothers running the empire for him. And really, between the 2 dowagers, it was Cixi calling the shots. Now Cixi never sat on the throne herself. She followed tradition, sort of. She sat behind a silk screen while male officials read their memorials aloud, and she gave instructions quietly from the other side, which was both symbolic and slightly creepy. Imagine a government meeting where the person in charge is literally hidden in another room, speaking through gauzy curtains. That was Qing politics under Cixi. She ruled for decades this way, first through Tongji, then through her nephew Guangxu, carefully keeping herself in charge while the nominal emperors played dress-up. Cixi has one of the most divided reputations in history. On one hand, she's accused of corruption, extravagance, and conservatism. Western writers in the 19th century loved to portray her as this dragon lady villain hoarding jewels while China crumbled. And to be fair, she did build a marble boat, an actual stone pleasure boat, in the imperial gardens with funds earmarked for the navy, which is not great optics when your country's losing wars at sea. On the other hand, she wasn't just a cartoon villain. She allowed railways, telegraphs, and some modern schools. She sponsored modest reforms, usually just enough to keep the dynasty limping along. Her main goal wasn't modernization or reform. It was survival, her survival, the dynasty's survival, and she was very, very good at that. The most dramatic moment came in 1898. Her nephew, the Guangxu emperor, young and idealistic, tried to push through a sweeping program of reforms, Western-style schools, a constitutional monarchy, the whole package. Cixi was not amused. Within 3 months, she staged another coup, put Guangxu under house arrest, and cancelled most of his reforms. Reformers were executed, silenced, or exiled. And once again, Cixi was in charge. From the outside, it looked like stubborn conservatism. From the inside, it looked like yet another empress, making sure no man, no minister, no emperor could sideline her. Cixi ruled almost until her death in 1908. By then, she had outlived rebellions, wars, and emperors. She died one day after Guangxu, suspicious timing that led to endless rumors she had him poisoned, just to make sure he didn't outlast her. With her gone, the Qing dynasty had only a few years left before collapsing entirely in 1911. In some ways, she was the last gasp of imperial China. the woman who held it together with stubborn hands, even as the world spun into modernity. Like Wu Zetian before her, Cixi's memory has been painted in extremes. Some call her a tyrant who doomed China to weakness. Others see her as a survivor, navigating an impossible situation with remarkable skill. What's undeniable is this: for nearly half a century, the most powerful person in China was not the emperor sitting on the throne, but the woman hidden behind the screen. And now, let's float west again, past the steppes, over the icy forests of Russia, because waiting for us there is another ruler with a knack for surviving chaos and bending empires to her will, Catherine the Great. She wasn't born Russian, she wasn't supposed to be empress, and her husband was, let's just say, not the sharpest sword in the arsenal. But she turned herself into one of Europe's greatest rulers, though not without a scandal or two along the way. Catherine the Great is one of those rulers who everyone thinks they know, usually because of gossip about her personal life. But the reality, it's far stranger, far lonelier, and far more impressive than the rumors. She wasn't Russian, not even close. She was born in 1729 as Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess from a small principality most of her future subjects couldn't find on a map. No one would have guessed she'd end up ruling the largest empire on earth. At age 15, Sophie was shipped off to Russia to marry the heir to the throne, Grand Duke Peter. Now Peter was, well, let's be charitable and say he was eccentric, obsessed with Prussia, toy soldiers, and apparently incapable of behaving like an adult. The marriage was a disaster. Catherine and Peter openly disliked each other. He preferred his mistresses, his military figurines, and drinking. She preferred reading, studying Russian, and quietly plotting a better future for herself. Still, she did her duty. She converted to Orthodoxy, changed her name to Catherine, and threw herself into learning Russian culture better than her German-born husband ever did. When Peter finally became Tsar Peter III in 1762, Catherine knew she had a problem. He immediately made enemies by pulling Russia out of a war and siding with Prussia, his idol, Frederick the Great. The nobility hated him. The army hated him. Even his own guards weren't thrilled. So Catherine did what any ambitious empress would do. She staged a coup. With the help of loyal guards and nobles, she declared herself empress, rode through St. Petersburg in uniform, and had Peter arrested. Within days he was dead under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was natural causes. Unofficially, well, palace coups rarely leave loose ends, and just like that, Catherine the Great became the ruler of Russia. Now, Catherine wasn't just ruthless. She was also curious, cultured, and surprisingly intellectual for someone running an empire by coup. She corresponded with Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot. She read political theory, tried to modernize Russia's laws, and promoted education for women. She also expanded Russia massively, winning territories from the Ottoman Empire, pushing into Poland, and extending Russia's reach to the Black Sea and Crimea. By the end of her reign, Russia was bigger, richer, and more firmly on the European stage than ever before. Of course, Catherine's personal life gets just as much attention as her political life. She and Peter had only one legitimate child together, and rumors swirled even about that. After becoming empress, Catherine took a series of lovers, many of them decades younger than her. Foreign gossips loved to exaggerate. Pamphlets painted her as insatiable, scandalous, even grotesque. The infamous story about her and a horse, pure slander made up by her enemies. But it stuck, because misogyny and juicy gossip always travel faster than facts. In reality, Catherine was pragmatic about her lovers. She treated them like trusted companions and political allies. When she grew tired of one, she often pensioned him off generously with estates and wealth, which is honestly quite civilized compared to most royal breakups. For all her power, Catherine was often lonely. She worked tirelessly, slept little, and micromanaged her empire. She adored art, books, and theatre, building collections that became the foundation of the Hermitage Museum. But she was always aware she wasn't truly Russian, and that her throne rested on the shaky foundation of a coup. When she died in 1796, after 34 years on the throne, Russia was transformed. Stronger, larger, more centralized, and very much stamped with her personal imprint. Catherine the Great remains one of the most famous rulers in history. But like Wu Zetian, like Cixi, she's remembered as much for scandal as for achievement. The gossip overshadows the reality, a foreign-born girl who seized power in one of the harshest courts in the world and held it for decades, turning Russia into a true empire. She ruled not because she was supposed to, but because she refused to let anyone else do it badly. And that stubbornness made her unforgettable. So let's drift onward through Russia's icy halls. Catherine wasn't the first woman to sit on the Russian throne. Before her came a few lesser-known empresses, Anna, Elizabeth, even the short-lived Regency of Sofia. Each of them left a little crack in the door Catherine later kicked wide open. But after Russia, our path will eventually bring us west, back into Europe, to revisit some queens who were just as forgotten and just as fascinating. Our first stop is with Princess Sophia Alexeyevna, who in the late 1600s found herself smack in the middle of Russia's dynastic mess. Her brothers were supposed to rule, Ivan Fee, who was chronically ill and almost entirely incapacitated, and Peter, the future Peter the Great, who was still a teenager with a dangerous fondness for toy cannons. Sophia looked at that setup and thought, nope, this empire needs an adult in the room. So when both brothers were declared co-tsars, in 1682 Sophia muscled her way in as regent. She ruled in their names, but really she ruled for herself. She was sharp, politically savvy, and capable of actually running the government, something her brothers could not claim. She worked with powerful boyar families, stabilized the court, and even tried her hand at diplomacy. For 6 years, Russia had a woman effectively running things. Of course, Peter the Great eventually grew up, stormed back into Moscow, and shoved her into a convent, which is the Russian political equivalent of unfriending someone permanently. But for a brief window, Sophia showed that even in an empire notoriously allergic to female rulers, a determined woman could seize the reins. Fast forward a few decades, and Russia got another female ruler, Anna Ivanovna, niece of Peter the Great. She wasn't supposed to do much. When she came to the throne in 1730, the nobility tried to limit her power by drafting conditions that would make her little more than a figurehead. Anna looked at those papers, tore them up, and ruled absolutely. So much for conditions. She wasn't particularly loved. She relied heavily on her German advisers, which made the Russian nobility seethe. She was also known for her harsh streak and her unusual sense of humour. Take, for example, the infamous Ice Palace. In 1740, as part of a bizarre court prank, she ordered a palace built entirely of ice on the frozen Neva River. Inside, she staged the forced marriage of one of her jesters, dressing him in a ridiculous outfit and making the poor couple spend their wedding night shivering inside the frozen walls. Romantic, right? Nothing says blissful union like frostbite. Her reign was cold in more ways than one. Autocratic, humourless, and disliked. But she proved once again that a woman on the throne could command the empire, whether the nobles liked it or not. If Anna was icy, her successor, Elizabeth Petrovna, daughter of Peter the Great, was all glitter and silk. She staged her own coup, in 1741 storming into the palace with guards and declaring herself empress, and yes, she pulled it off while wearing a sparkling ball gown. Because why not? Elizabeth's reign was remembered for extravagance. She loved parties, masquerades, and French fashion. She allegedly owned around 15,000 dresses, which makes modern shopaholics look restrained. But she wasn't just about the wardrobe. Elizabeth abolished the death penalty in Russia, which, for a supposedly frivolous empress, was a surprisingly humane move. She also strengthened the Church's power and steered Russia through the 7 Years' War. Foreign diplomats sometimes dismissed her as unserious, but she kept the empire stable, expanded its influence, and set the stage for the next generation. Without her, there would have been no smooth path for Catherine later. Sophia proved women could rule in Russia. Anna showed they could rule absolutely. And Elizabeth glamorized the job while still making solid policy. Together they created a century-long tradition of women on the throne that culminated in Catherine the Great. It's almost ironic. In a country that prided itself on strongman rulers, some of the most decisive leadership in the 17th and 18th centuries came from women. And yet, they're remembered today mostly for side notes. Sophia locked away, Anna with her ice palace prank, Elizabeth with her closets full of gowns. But behind those anecdotes were women who held together a turbulent empire when men around. Them were either too weak, too sick, or too distracted with toy soldiers to bother. So from icy palaces to glittering ballrooms, Russia's forgotten empresses remind us that history loves to exaggerate the men but tends to reduce the women to caricatures. And yet here they were, regents, autocrats, and power brokers in their own right. Next, we'll gently drift westward again, leaving the frozen Neva and heading back to Europe, to queens who fought their way into power in courts filled with betrayal, bad marriages, and more tragic dynasties than even Russia could muster. Let's start in Spain, or rather Castile, before Spain was even fully united. Joanna of Castile, born in 1479, had the misfortune of being the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Yes, the same duo who sponsored Columbus and kicked off Spain's global empire. Now you'd think being their daughter would set Joanna up nicely. Rich kingdom, powerful family, golden future. Instead, she became known to history as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, which is unfair because her madness seems to have been less about actual insanity and more about depression, grief, and being stuck in a dynastic cage. Joanna was married off to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy. And yes, he was apparently very handsome. But he was also shallow, unfaithful, and arrogant. Their marriage was passionate but toxic. The kind of pairing where everyone else in the palace could see it wasn't going to end well. When Joanna's mother Isabella died in 1504, Joanna inherited Castile. Suddenly she was queen in her own right, but her father, her husband, and later her son all decided she was too unstable to rule. Funny how that worked out. Philip conveniently took over until his sudden death. Ferdinand swooped back in to help. Later, her son Charles, better known as Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, kept her confined in a convent for decades, declaring her unfit. Modern historians think Joanna wasn't truly insane. She was grieving, deeply depressed and manipulated by the men around her who had every reason to sideline her. Yet she remained technically Queen of Castile for half a century. A queen locked in a tower remembered more foreigners than for her actual rule. Sliding north into England, we meet Margaret of Anjou, one of the fiercest women in the Wars of the Roses. She was French by birth, married to the weak King Henry VI of England, who spent much of his reign either deeply pious or deeply catatonic. Margaret looked at her husband and thought, well, someone's got to keep the crown on this family's head, so she took over. When Henry fell into bouts of mental collapse, staring at walls, refusing to speak, forgetting he was king, Margaret stepped up as the leader of the Lancastrian faction. She raised armies, led campaigns, and did everything she could to keep her son, Edward, in line for the throne. Her enemies called her the she-wolf of France, which was meant as an insult, but honestly makes her sound like a metal band front woman. She was ruthless, yes, but also desperate, caught in a civil war where her family's survival depended on fighting tooth and nail. In the end, she lost. Her son was killed, her husband was deposed and later murdered, and she was forced back to France in disgrace. But for years, Margaret had been the true power behind the English crown, fighting harder than most of the men who supposedly led the war. Now let's wander into France. Anne of Brittany, born in 1477, inherited her duchy as a child. Brittany was one of the last great semi-independent regions in France, and everyone wanted it, including the French crown. Poor Anne was married off not once but twice. First to King Charles VIII of France, who died young after hitting his head on a doorframe. Yes, really, death by doorframe. And then to his cousin and successor, Louis the Ruthven. Both marriages were less about romance and more about swallowing Brittany into France. Anne resisted as much as she could. She insisted on being crowned twice as Queen of France, styled herself as a sovereign in her own right, and poured resources into preserving Breton culture and independence. But the tide of centralization was against her. When she died in 1514, Brittany was effectively fused to France. Yet she's remembered fondly in Brittany as a duchess who fought to the end against being erased, even while wearing a French crown. What Joanna, Margaret, and Anne all show is how queenship in Western Europe often came with heavy strings attached. Unlike Russia or China, where women could sometimes openly rule, in places like Spain, England, and France, the idea of female sovereignty was treated like a scandal. So when queens stepped up, whether it was Joanna inheriting Castile, Margaret leading armies, or Anne clinging to her duchy, they were often pushed back, confined, or vilified. The irony is that many of them proved more capable than the men around them. But history, as usual, slapped them with labels like mad, she-wolf, or obstinate. From convents in Castile to battlefields in England, these women shaped the politics of Europe from the shadows. But we're not done yet, because Europe also had queens whose power came not just from accident or necessity, but from sheer force of will, the kind of women who bent kingdoms to their personalities and sometimes to their neuroses. Next, we'll drift toward the Habsburgs and the French court, where powdered wigs, dynastic inbreeding, and dramatic palace life gave queens all the material they needed to be remembered or forgotten in spectacular ways. The Habsburgs were champions of inbreeding. Their motto might as well have been, "Why diversify the family tree when you can just keep pruning the same branch?" Take Empress Maria of Spain, who married her uncle, Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, too. Yes, her uncle. Because apparently Europe's ruling families thought genetics were optional. Maria, born in 1528, was the daughter of Charles V, the same Charles who ruled over half of Europe and the Americas. She was intelligent, pious, and dutiful. When she married Maximilian, she became Empress Consort, living in Vienna but constantly torn between her Spanish roots and her new Austrian role. Her life was consumed by dynastic duty, producing children, promoting Catholic orthodoxy, and keeping the sprawling, unwieldy Habsburg Empire glued together. She had 16 children, a level of fertility that probably shortened her life, as it did for so many royal women. What's striking is how little she's remembered today. Maria was central to the continuation of the Habsburg line, but because she didn't stage coups or build ice palaces, history filed her under quiet background queens. In reality, she was the hinge holding two massive dynasties together. Now, before Maria came another Habsburg powerhouse, Margaret of Austria. She never became a queen in her own right, but as a regent, she was basically running half of Europe. Born in 1480, Margaret had the typical Habsburg childhood, betrothed at 3, widowed at 20, shuffled between courts like a pawn. After her second husband died, she never remarried, and instead became regent of the Netherlands for her nephew, Charles IV. She ruled with competence, diplomacy, and style, turning her court at Michelin into a cultural hub. She negotiated treaties, balanced the fractious Low Countries, and provided stability in a period when everything else was on fire. Her nickname? The Great Governess, which sounds like something out of a stern Victorian children's novel, but it fit. She raised, educated, and politically guided the next generation of Habsburg rulers. And while the men strutted around with crowns and titles, it was Margaret who quietly kept the machine running. Jumping forward a few centuries, we meet Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi. She technically comes later than most of our queens here, but she's too haunting to skip. Born in 1837 into Bavarian nobility, she married Emperor Franz Joseph at just 16. She was beautiful, romantic, and completely unprepared for the suffocating world of the Viennese court. Elizabeth hated court life. She loathed the endless rituals, the controlling mother-in-law, and the rigid expectations. She developed what we'd probably call an eating disorder today, obsessing over her figure, exercising compulsively, and living on bizarre diets. She also travelled constantly to escape Vienna, becoming almost a ghost in her own empire. While she technically held the title of Empress, Sisi had little political influence. Yet her legend grew after her tragic assassination in 1898, when an anarchist stabbed her in Geneva. Suddenly she was remembered as a tragic beauty, the fairy tale empress who couldn't bear the cage she was locked in. It's ironic, in her own life, she was dismissed as frivolous, unhappy, and aloof. But after her death, she became one of the most romanticized queens in Europe, the subject of films, novels, and endless nostalgia. What the Habsburg queens show us is how dynasty often swallowed individuality. They were essential, marrying strategically, producing heirs, smoothing over rivalries, but the credit usually went to their husbands or sons. And yet figures like Margaret of Austria and Sisi break through the fog. Margaret, because she actually governed, Sisi because she so visibly rebelled against her gilded cage. The Habsburgs were masters at using queens as glue. Glue to stick Spain and Austria together. Glue to keep the Low Countries quiet. Glue to hold up a dynasty that might otherwise have collapsed under its own overgrown jawlines. So, from Vienna's palaces, let's drift a little west again, to France. Because if there's any court that produced unforgettable yet sidelined queens, it's the glittering, scandal-ridden, perfumed circus of Versailles. Catherine de' Medici gets one of the worst reputations of any queen in European history. Born into the powerful Florentine Medici family, she married King Henry II of France in 1533. She was tiny, not especially beautiful, and not exactly the star of the Valois court, but then Henry died in a jousting accident because, of course, medieval jousts were still a thing in the 1500s. And suddenly Catherine found herself regent for her young sons. That's when she transformed, from overlooked consort into one of the most influential women in France. She ruled through 3 different kings, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, each one more fragile than the last. Catherine became the real power, trying desperately to hold France together during the bloody wars of religion. She's remembered for poison, plots, and black gowns. Was she really the puppet master behind the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre? Historians debate it. But the legend of Catherine as a ruthless, scheming black queen stuck. In reality, she was trying to survive in an impossible situation: religious civil war, weak heirs, and a collapsing dynasty. She was pragmatic, manipulative, and deeply protective of her children. Was she ruthless? Absolutely. But she had to be. Fast forward 2 centuries, and we land in Versailles with Marie Antoinette. Born an Austrian archduchess, she married the awkward Louis XVI at 14, expected to cement peace between Austria and France. The French people never accepted her. She was foreign, frivolous, and apparently incapable of producing an heir for years, which of course became the court's favorite gossip topic. When she did have children, she loved them deeply, but by then her reputation was already ruined. The
Legend of let them eat cake? Total myth. She never said it.
But in the eyes of starving peasants, she was the symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy: waste, luxury, aloofness. The truth is more complicated. She was extravagant, yes, gambling, fashion, and parties were her escape from a husband who preferred locks and hunting to intimacy. But she also tried, however clumsily, to influence policy and showed real bravery in the face of the revolution. Her end came at the guillotine in 1793. She was 37, worn down and heartbroken, and yet she faced her death with dignity, reportedly apologizing to her executioner when she accidentally stepped on his foot. For a woman remembered as frivolous, her final act was remarkably human. France loved its kings, but its queens, they were often either demonized or romanticized. Catherine became the scheming poisoner, Marie Antoinette the shallow party girl. Even Anne of Austria, mother of Louis XIV, or Marie de Medici, got reduced to stereotypes of manipulative foreigners. And yet, like elsewhere, these women often held France together when the men around them fell short. They maneuvered, negotiated, and sometimes simply endured. Their lives were lived under the brightest spotlight in Europe, and history has judged them far more harshly than their male counterparts. So, what do we make of all these forgotten queens? From Empress Wu in China to Catherine the Great in Russia, from Joanna of Castile to Marie Antoinette, the pattern repeats. Queens and empresses often wielded enormous influence, but their power was almost always disguised, denied, or twisted in memory. They became caricatures: the mad queen, the she-wolf, the black widow, the frivolous Austrian. But in the quiet spaces, in regencies and back rooms, in letters and decrees, they shaped kingdoms just as much as the men who officially ruled. And maybe
that's why they're so fascinating as bedtime companions.
their stories aren't loud battles or dramatic speeches. They're quieter, shadowier, threaded with irony, loneliness, and resilience. Exactly the kind of tales that lull us into reflection as we drift into sleep. So tonight, as we've wandered through palaces and harems, convents and battlefields, we've seen that queens were never just ornaments. They were survivors. Some ruthless, some tragic, some flamboyant, all unforgettable once you look past the myths. And as you sink deeper into your pillows, let their lives remind you. History isn't just about kings with crowns and swords. Sometimes it's about the women who ruled in the shadows with ink, whispers, alliances, and sheer stubborn will. So close your eyes now. Let the voices of these forgotten queens fade into the night. Tomorrow the world will go on, but for now, in this quiet moment, the queens still reign. Good night.